Podcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Happy Friday, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I am Diane Elias with Minnesota Housing, and I'm here with Nancy Urbanski, and I'll let Nancy introduce herself quick.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am Nancy, as Diane said. I'm so glad that you all joined us today.
And together we're known as Diancy. That's something one of our coworkers actually came up with a couple months ago, which we thought was clever. So we manage the Family Homeless Prevention and Assistance Program through Minnesota Housing. And this is a file documentation training for, kind of helping folks to organize and set up files for the households that they'll be serving through this program. And we are recording it, so you're able to access that information after. We'll make sure to send out the recording link and other pertinent information like the PowerPoint so that you can kind of see it all together. So I'll just get started here today. If you like, you're welcome to put names and organizations in the chat. We are not going to be able to do introductions just because there's such a large number of people participating. So feel free to do that. And I'm going to go off camera now so that you can see our mission. Housing is the foundation for success, so we collaborate with individuals, communities, and partners to create, preserve, and finance housing that is affordable. And then I'm going to start with doing an FHPAP overview, and then we'll go through the file documentation. And we'll talk a little bit more about FHPAP resources for the program, and then we'll have some time for questions as well. And we'll start with the FHPAP overview. Many of you are aware of how our program operates, but we thought just for any new staff, this would be important to cover as well. So the FHPAP program was established in 1993 by the Minnesota legislature. It was a bipartisan effort that received a lot of support, and I believe Hennepin County paved the way for this legislation. It's a little bit unusual for a program with services to be operated out of Minnesota Housing. Minnesota Housing does operate a number of rent assistance programs, but services, typically you see more of that coming through the Department of Human Services. So it's kind of a program that includes both, and we obviously collaborate pretty closely with the Department of Human Services and their programs as well. So the program is really intended to prevent and end homelessness with services and direct assistance to households. And the eligible activities include coordinated entry, which is the work that's done when households are facing homelessness and access a single entry point to connect with services. And then we also include street outreach, and that's really for connecting with households who are homeless and living outdoors or in a vehicle or in a place that's unfit for human habitation, and trying to connect those households with services and assistance as well. We also allow for funds to be used for prevention. That's to help keep people in their current housing, and typically that involves some services and rent assistance. And then we also have funds for rapid rehousing, and rapid rehousing is for assisting households who are currently experiencing homelessness back into their housing quickly. I will say that prevention and rapid rehousing for our program can look really similar. Often it includes some services and some direct financial assistance. And so the distinction really is whether a household is not in a lease or experiencing homelessness versus a household that is, currently in a situation where they're living in an apartment or in a housing, have a mortgage. That would really be considered prevention. But both of those activities can sometimes allow for multiple months of assistance if needed to help people keep their homes or to help them settle into new homes. And the funding is awarded every 2 years. The timeline for that is October to the end of September of the calendar year, and it always runs for 2 years. So for this biennium, It is October 1st, 2021 to September 30th, 2023. The program does serve all populations, families, singles, youth, and unaccompanied youth. Funds are used for, as I mentioned, services and then direct financial assistance. And the direct financial assistance can be things like rent, mortgage assistance, utilities, any housing related expense that will help the household stabilize in housing. And then there's also up to 10% that can be used for administrative costs. The funds cannot be used for more than 24 months of assistance. And one question we get a lot is, does that include services or is it just rental assistance? And our legal staff have made the determination that the statute really precludes us from being able to offer more than 24 months total, whether it's services or assistance.
And if I may, it sounds like there might be somebody that's unmuted. And if you could mute your line, we'd greatly appreciate it.
All right, thank you. And then eligible recipients include recipients whose household income is at or below 200% of federal poverty guidelines. They also have to be a Minnesota resident or a household otherwise approved by Minnesota Housing, or they need to be homeless or at imminent risk of homelessness and in need of services or financial assistance. And the reason for this is just making sure to document that the household doesn't have another means for paying for the housing emergency and that they're able to, and so as a result of that, they are able to request assistance through this program. All right, so now we will head into file documentation. And Nancy, I just wanted to ask, is the slide related to households experiencing domestic violence also included?
I believe I thought it was on this PowerPoint, Diane.
Okay, it might come up after the checklist. If not, then we'll just talk about it. So the file review checklist includes sort of 10 important things that we look for when we're monitoring a file. One thing that we look for is just the application or the intake form for the household. And sometimes that's really an agency-driven form that has the data and information that you're collecting in order to put that into your own systems, and also the data that you're collecting that you might be reporting back to us for some reason, or there might be other reasons why you have like a specific intake form, but it's not something that Minnesota Housing generates. It's usually where the household is actually entering your program. And as a result of having that intake form, we often use that to identify what type of activity and what household type is being served. And so I'll get into that in a little bit more detail later, but just letting you know that those are a little bit tied together. And then we look for 3 forms: the Tennyson warning, the HMIS release of information form, and that's the Homeless Management Information System, and then also the agency's release of information form. We are also looking for some type of assessment or a score related to being screened to be eligible for the program, and I'll get into more detail on that. There's also a housing crisis and proof of responsibility that we look for, and need for financial assistance, which goes along with that item that I mentioned before. Oh, and for some reason, the other few are missing. Oh, you know what? It looks like there's our slide. Okay, I'll go back to that. So number 7 is the income and sort of the documentation around income that shows that the household is at 200% or below federal poverty guidelines. And then we also look for the amount, date, and type of assistance provided, as well as some evidence of the crisis being resolved. And then we often refer to case notes and expect to see those in the file as well. So for those households who are experiencing domestic violence, setting up files is a little bit more complex than just what we're going to review here. And we also run into this with monitoring as well. So what I can say is that we're all learning about how to set up the files related to people experiencing domestic violence. And each agency has kind of taken it upon themselves to figure out how they're going to mitigate the risk that could happen if files contain personal information for people who are survivors or currently fleeing domestic violence. I included in the PowerPoint an article that covers some of the data that's protected and some of the relevant laws related to what can be included in a file for these households. And then also a confidentiality toolkit that I think could be really helpful as you set up your files. And then I would just say, although we're not covering that in depth in this file monitoring training, I think the important piece to know is just that we'll continue to try to bring information back to you about what we're learning as well. So there may be, future opportunities where we cover more on this topic. All right, so another piece that I just want to share with you really quick is that we have an FHPAP file review worksheet that we use when we go out to monitor files for organizations who are participating in our program. And you can see that it kind of follows exactly those items that I was talking about here. We check the files to make sure that they're included, make sure that they're signed and dated, make sure that we have the right dates for how the households were served. And this file form is really helpful if you've never set up a file before and are looking to figure out how to set it up. Having a copy of this will be really useful to you. Some organizations actually have a copy of this file checklist at the beginning of every file folder, and it can really help just make sure that you've got all the documents in the file that are needed. The other piece of advice that I would give is that sometimes your programs are more robust than just providing FHPAP services and assistance, and you might have other things in the file that are related to other programs. And for the purposes of FHPAP, you may just want to have a separate section for FHPAP, or here's all the documents that would apply. It makes the file monitoring, when you're going back and looking at your files in preparation for us coming out for a visit, it just makes it go a little bit easier because okay, this section is for the FHPAP files versus these other sections might be for other programs. And that way, it just makes it a little bit easier to review yourselves and then also for us to review. And we'll make sure that everybody gets a copy of that so that there's no surprises. You'll know exactly what checklist we're using when we come through. Oops, I forgot to go from the beginning. All right, so the first item is the application date, and that's the date that the households referred to your program. So sometimes this will be on a form that is sent in through coordinated entry. So for example, households that you're serving with rapid rehousing often come to you through coordinated entry, and they'll have a form from the coordinated entry that gives the referral date. Other times it's a little bit harder for us to tell, but sometimes there's a date on an application, for example, and we look to that. Then we also look at when's the first contact, like after that household came through the door and they kind of had that first moment of calling, or someone filled out a partial intake because they called and contacted the agency, then how long did it take before the household actually received contact back from the agency? In many cases, that can be the same day, especially if it's someone you're working with related to outreach because you're already with the household when that happens, or in prevention, sometimes households are just seeking a month of assistance and they come in the office and you're able to serve them that same day. But we really do look at the time between the first time that the client contacts you for assistance or is referred for assistance and when they actually receive assistance. And then we have 4 activity types and 4 household types. The activities are coordinated entry, street outreach, prevention, and rapid rehousing, as I mentioned. And then here's those household types again. Again, this definitely covers all populations, but we do break out the households by types. And we typically see this in intake forms, but it's not always there. And if we can't find what type of activity or household type from the intake form, then we usually look at the HMIS form, because the HMIS form does include the breakout of this. Then there's some other important forms that we look at that are in the file, and one is the HMIS Release of Information and Data Privacy Notice. That form is available on HMIS's website, and there's supposed to be a separate form for each adult. So because they're releasing information to be included in a system that can be accessed by other providers and potentially by our agency, for example, we really need to make sure that each household member who's an adult has signed off on a form. And so that's why we expect that we'll see a form for each adult in the household. And then if a household can't sign, and the agency is able to get the verbal consent, you are able to indicate this on the signature line by just saying, I talked to the household on, you know, say 4/30/2022, and they gave me permission to consent for their participation. I think that's really important that we have that ability to do that. However, it's also important to check with your own agency. Each agency operates different and takes their own legal risk. And so there are agencies that may say, you know, we actually don't ever want to do that verbal consent piece. We don't want to be responsible for, you know, the privacy issue that that could create. So just make sure that if you're doing that, you're checking with your own legal staff. The Tennyson form is also a form that's signed by all adults in the household. However, on this form, we sometimes see like more than one signature line, and then the households sign on the same form. And the really important piece for this form to remember is that Minnesota Housing has to be listed as one of the organizations that can receive information about the household. In some cases, the forms are really generic, like they might say every state agency, or they might not say any agency. It's best if they can actually be named. And so what I would do is if you are operating a program that receives our funding, and maybe you want to use this form for a program that also is receiving DHS funding, for example, it's okay to list both of our agencies on the form, but you do want to spell those out so that people really understand where their information might go. And then your agency often has a release of information form as well. And while we don't provide a template for this, we do expect that the agency will be requesting a release of information for any other party that they talk to. So for example, if you have a household where rent is due and you need some documentation from the landlord, or need to communicate with the landlord about what's happening and that you're going to be sending a check, you would want to secure a release of information from the household member to the landlord to say it's okay for you to share the information for the landlord. And we do expect, again, that there's a release of information for each adult member in the household. That way, if someone decides later to leave the household, or they want to choose not to share information, that they're not beholden to the initial release of information. And then if you have questions about when you should have a release with a party, you're certainly welcome to talk to your own legal staff. There's sometimes partnerships in agencies that they've already created, or memorandums of understanding, and some of that gets included then in the release of information. So I don't want to, you know, necessarily tell you exactly how you have to go about doing your release of information, but just try to make sure that you have one in place and that you're using it with any organizations that you're contacting. The other thing that I'll just note is that most organizations do have a sunset date on the release of information. It's often a year, And that just, again, protects that household's privacy going in the future, that you wouldn't be able to talk to the landlord, say, 20 years from now. So for the assessment tool and score, this particular part of the file monitoring is a little bit more complex now. We used to have a system where nearly everyone in the state of Minnesota was using the VI-SPDAT if the household came through coordinated entry. So that's households who are experiencing homelessness. And so we would see a VI-SPDAT score, that vulnerability index score, in the file. And we would be able to tell that that household had gone through coordinated entry and that they had a score that meant that they were eligible to receive funds through the program. And then if they were coming through prevention, we had what's called the Minnesota Homeless Prevention Assessment Tool, or MPAT. And that is a FHPAP only assessment, although programs could certainly use it for other prevention resources, but we're probably the main resource out there besides economic assistance, like emergency assistance or emergency general assistance. So we are expecting that for prevention, we would see a score for the MPAT. But for homeless households, things have changed with coordinated entry, where we may not have a continuum of care that's using the VI-SPDAT. They may be in the middle of looking for a new tool, or they may be doing their assessment process and scoring process differently, or they may not be scoring. They may just be working with the referrals that they have on hand and then meeting on a weekly basis. So we recognize that we may not see scores in the file every time if folks are not using that tool. And we will definitely take that into consideration. We just mostly need to know about it. So if you're not using the VI-SPDAT in your continuum of care, just remind us of that when you're, when we come out to monitor files or you send files to us, give us a reminder that you're not using the VI-SPDAT. And that'll really help us to determine what this should look like in the file. And then if you're not using the VI-SPDAT, give us some indication of what you do in order to figure out households are eligible and prioritize those households. I think that's more what we need to know, just so that we can look for that kind of documentation in the file. And then the other thing to remember about the MPAT is just if you end up serving a lower scoring household, and maybe that's not the households that you've said you were going to target with your program, just make sure that there's a note in there. In some cases, we see a lower score, but the case manager, for example, knows the household really well and knows that the score is probably higher. Maybe they've recognized that the landlord is going to evict within 2 weeks, but the household hasn't indicated that, for example. And so something that you just are able to do with the MPAT is be able to override the score. Even though the score shows a certain number, you can override that because we trust your judgment. And so just make sure that in your case notes in the file, you're telling us why, even though it's lower scoring, that this household is receiving some assistance, and that really helps us. So we also look for evidence of the housing crisis and proof of responsibility. So in this circumstance, it's typically something that says that the household owes back rent, owes a past due utility, is going to be unable to pay rent for something. Maybe they had a medical emergency. And then also it's basically just a way for you to know that this household is experiencing a crisis. Sometimes it's even on the intake form. But we typically look for this information on the intake form itself or in the case notes. And then we also sometimes see like a different type of proof of the bill. So maybe a utility bill or the amount of rent owed. We might see a copy of a lease. There might be a letter or email from the landlord. Sometimes people do, kind of copy of an email exchange that they've had with the landlord. And then if you don't have, maybe it's a verbal lease, for example. So there's not a lease, but you're verifying with the landlord that the money is owed, and you had that a telephone conversation about that, just make sure that you're noting that really clearly in your case notes and saying, you know, this is a verbal lease situation. I know this landlord, I did verify with them that they were behind on rent by $500, and so, you know, on such and such a date, and then put that in your case note. And then we also look for information that shows that there's a need for financial assistance. So someone may be behind on rent, they may owe a back utilities or bill, but one thing that we're looking for is to show that they need the financial assistance, and that can be really simple. We often find it in the case notes, and typically it's just a reason why the client can't pay. Maybe they had to pay for a car repair and so they weren't able to pay rent. Maybe they experienced a mental health issue and weren't able to pay rent. You know, we don't even really need to know so much the reason, but you could even just say, you know, I spoke with the household and determined that they are unable to pay the rent from their own resources. And so something like that is enough to be able to justify it in the case notes. You just want to make sure that you have something in there, but we don't necessarily need a lot of detail on what that reason is. All right, and so I'm going to turn it over to Nancy, who's going to cover income documentation.
Thank you, Diane. As Diane covered earlier, for households to be eligible for FHPAP assistance, they need to have household income at or below 200% of federal poverty guidelines. And so we want to see documentation of this in the file. What agencies often ask for income on multiple forms, and it's not unusual to see varying amounts in the file. So for example, a household might self-report their income on an intake form, and that amount may differ after a staff conducts their income calculation. So make sure that you choose the correct amount and have it stand out in the file, or in a case note, you can document the final income determination. Formal documentation and third-party verification continue to be the best methods for verifying household income. However, during this pandemic, Minnesota Housing is allowing households to self-report income when necessary. Self-reporting of income should only be used when more appropriate methods are unavailable. When self-reporting is used, staff should inquire about a wide variety of potential income sources and then document that response in the client's file. Staff must still calculate annual income and must make sure that the household meets the income requirements for FHPAP. Secondly, we also need to see in the income calculation that the household is at or below 200% of federal poverty guidelines. And we'll talk about calculating income in just a moment. On this screen, you can see a list of what is included in income calculation, and you can also find this in our program guide that's located on Minnesota Housing's FHPAP website. I won't review this entire list, but we'll just go over a few. So salaries and wages from employment, including overtime, is included in income calculation. And make sure here that you're using the gross amount of pay or the amount before deductions due to taxes and other deductions. Others that are included are unemployment benefits or public assistance benefits such as the Minnesota Family Investment Program, also known as MFIP, and Social Security. Child support and alimony received by the household is included in income. And conversely, if you have a household that's required to make alimony or child support payments, while it is a deduction in their take-home pay, this must be included in income calculation as well. And next slide, please. On this screen, you can see a list of income exclusions. Earned income for household members that are 17 years and under is not counted, nor non-cash benefits such as food support or medical assistance. During the pandemic, we amended our program guide to reflect that advance payments of child tax credits are not included in income calculation, and emergency rental assistance received, such as those that were authorized in the America Rescue Plan through the Rent, Help, and Mend program, for example, are not included. And we kept these on here because while the child tax credit payments have exhausted, there is a chance in the future that, if the pandemic should re-emerge, that something like this could be authorized again. And so we chose to highlight these for that reason. Next slide, please. Well, verbal verification is acceptable, as we said. Formal documentation and third party continue to be the best methods. The one on this list that I want to touch on is earned income, because many of the households you serve have pay amounts that may vary from paycheck to paycheck. For example, they work part-time. The best practice here is to obtain a minimum of 2 pay stubs in order to get a more accurate picture of that household income. And you may choose to obtain more. An example could include if a household, if you obtain 2 pay stubs from a household and in one of those checks, they received overtime. And when you calculate income, you find that they're over. If the household tells you that overtime is very rare. Like, for example, let's say it's the week before the holiday and that it's not a true reflection of their annual income, you could request more copies of their pay stubs. And in doing so, it's possible that you could calculate their income and they would be eligible. If a household has 0 income, you can document either in a case note, or you can also use a 0 income self-certification form, though we don't require that. We just want to make sure that's documented somewhere, including the date that the household provided that information to you. And generally speaking, we really learned this, especially during the pandemic. Sometimes the difficulty that it was for households to submit documentation of, release of information forms or income, for example. So we just wanted to let you know that we're really open to the methods in which they provide this to you. And if they submit a screenshot to you, for example, that shows you their pay stub, that's acceptable to us. Next slide. Okay, thank you. It's generally easy to calculate household income if, for example, they receive MFIP. It's a little bit more complex to determine income if they have multiple sources of income or if they have part-time income where their pay stubs vary. We've created an income calculation workbook that can assist you in accurately calculating income. And use of this document isn't required, but it can be a helpful and easy way in determining if the household is eligible for assistance. Your agency may already have a tool or document that they use, and that's just fine. If you do not use a tool, we do need to see that you show the math that demonstrates how you determine their final income. And one common mistake that we see when people calculate income by hand is this example. If a household provides you with 2 biweekly pay stubs, which seems to be the most common method in which households are paid, sometimes we'll see that a staff will take those 2 pay stubs and multiply that by 12 months. And in doing so, you're really only capturing 48 weeks of income versus the 52. And while rare, we actually have seen where that miscalculation has resulted in a household receiving assistance for which they were not eligible. And so if that happens, funds need to either be reallocated to another household or return to Minnesota Housing. And so using this income workbook or something similar can help mitigate some errors that we see that are common. And Diane, I'll ask you to pull it up and I'll just provide just a very brief overview of this tool for those of you that haven't seen it. Thank you. So Diana, can you go to the head of household income, the first tab after the instructions? There you go. Thank you. So there's instructions on this tab, and there's 3 additional tabs. And so the first one is for determining head of household income. And in the scenario that I provided here, this household gets paid biweekly, and you received 3 pay stubs from them. And so you would just enter those 3 pay stubs in the biweekly 3 pay stub category, and that calculated that household's annual income. For the second household, and you can go to that one, Diane, In this scenario, the household has Social Security income. And I think if you scroll down, Diane.
Am I on the right screen?
You are on the right screen. It just,
Okay,
you just scroll down a little bit. Thank you. There you go. So in this scenario, oh, I'm sorry, I entered MFIP. I think MFIP's amounts have increased, but in my days it was 532, so I entered that amount. And so I entered that household's MFIP income, and so that household has an income of $63.84. And so when you go to the first tab, it will calculate both household number one and household number two's income. And also there's a tab it's not showing on here, but there is a fourth tab that actually shows that, in this case, the 2022 federal poverty guidelines. And so if you want to just double check that the household meets those guidelines, you can refer to this. And in this household scenario is a 2-person household, and you can see that they meet the federal poverty guidelines. Thanks, Diane. For households receiving ongoing assistance, it's best practice to reassess their income every 3 months to verify that the household continues to qualify for FHPAP. There may be times, especially during the pandemic, where that doesn't happen exactly at that 3rd month, and that's okay. We're just indicating at this time that it's the best practice. We do ask that you make every attempt to obtain documentation when there's a new source of income. For example, if a household's previous and sole source of income was MFIP, and now they've gained employment. Also, if you learn that a household's income has increased shortly after their income assessment, we do not require that you reassess the household at that time. Rather, you can wait until the next increment to reevaluate. And part of the reason that we do this is, number one, to reduce your burden as a staff who's reassessing, as well as the household. But also, even if in that window they're over income, we're okay with that, because we realize, number one, that income can fluctuate up and down. And also, if it provides the household with additional time to obtain housing stability, that's what we want to see, and we're okay with that. We will be updating our program guide. We currently don't have guidance in there about reassessing income. And so we expect that guide to come out late summer, and we will be including more guidance on this, so stay tuned. We also look for the amount, the date, and the type of assistance provided. And oftentimes we'll see this in a purchase order, a payment voucher, or a copy of the check. And sometimes in case documentation that substantiates how the FHPAP funds were expended for the household. If the amount of assistance provided is not the same as the household indicates they need, we want to find the other funding source that was used to pay for that remaining assistance, whether it was from another agency or emergency assistance, or the household was able to come up with the other portion of the funds. But we really like to see that that full amount of assistance is provided that will help resolve the housing crisis. Before a household is exited, a determination should be made in consultation with the household that their housing crisis has been resolved. You can indicate this on an agency form or in a case note. For example, documenting that a follow-up call occurred and the household is stably housed. There have been times we've monitored a file and, for example, a household received 1 or 2 months assistance. And at the time that that file was closed and the household was exited, at least in our opinion, it appeared the household was unstable. Like, for example, their mental health crisis wasn't really at a place of resolution where their day-to-day functioning was at an acceptable level for them. And we'd much rather see that you keep that household file open a little bit longer and conduct additional follow-up as needed, even if it's just for an additional month, than close that file knowing that the household may be still unstably housed. Case notes provide you the opportunity show us all of the great work that you're doing, in addition to documenting the work that you're doing. And make sure to document each contact or attempted contact. Even if a household's not engaged, we want to see that you've been attempting phone calls or emails or text messages. The best practice is that households are contacted a minimum of once a month. However, this will vary depending on the household needs. For example, if a household's experiencing a high level of mental health issues, or if they have a high MPAT score, for example, that may be evidence that they need more frequent contact in the beginning. And it's not uncommon that as the household stabilizes, that contact would then be reduced to less frequently. And we do recognize that households are not actively engaged in services. And so again, if that's the case, just document that you're making those attempted contacts. Keep in mind that a household can request access to their file, and there actually have been instances where a household file has been subpoenaed by the court. And so when case noting, be clear and concise and avoid interjecting opinions or judgments in the case notes. One thing I wanted to share with you is when Minnesota Housing was preparing to launch our recent Housing Stability Services RFP, we had the opportunity to engage constituents throughout the state, and we had over 1,000 responses. And we asked one question of those individuals, which was, in the scope of service delivery, what elements are the most important to you? What do you need to see to make you feel supported and to make you feel valued? And a large number of individuals responded that follow up and follow through are very important. And so that's also one thing that we're looking for. And so just making sure that you're closing the loop with that household. If you're going to provide them resources, indicating that you've done so, and then especially closing the loop in that last follow-up contact before you close that file. And lastly, this is a link to our FHPAP webpage. We have the statute that provides the guidance for this program. And there's also other documents that were referenced during this presentation, including the program guide and the income calculation workbook. And so we welcome you to review that at any time. And generally, when we update any of the documents on our webpage, we do notify our FHPAP contact list, which includes FHPAP coordinators and many providers, to provide them with an update that information is available. And that concludes our portion of the presentation. And so we have ample time to take questions from all of you. So feel free to unmute yourself if you're comfortable in asking. Oh, no, we'll have to unmute you. I apologize. I was thinking we were using another format. So I'm going to be monitoring the questions and the chat. Bear with me as I try to make this larger. There was one question asking if we were going to be sending out the PowerPoint, and we will definitely do that along with some of the materials that we referenced today. And we also will be posting this recording on our FHPAP webpage. Waiting to see if there's any questions.
Hi, Nancy. This is Christy. We do have a few hands raised.
All right. Thank you, Christy. I'm a little slow navigating this. I appreciate it. Sorry, folks. Brenda, you have a question, and if you, I think your audio is off. I'm not sure if you're able to ask your question, or perhaps it's in the chat. I'll take a look at that. Christy, if you're able to help me navigate this, I want to make sure we're using our time effectively, and I'm a little bit.
I do. We have Lori. Lori, you have been unmuted. On my end, you are self-muted. If you want to unmute and ask your question.
Okay, hi, this is Lori. I'm with Catholic Charities. And I'm not sure you guys will have an answer to this question, but it's something I'm wondering if you've ever considered. So we predominantly work with single adults, and when we get somebody who doesn't have a child in the home, but they're paying significant amounts of child support, and so their income looks high, but the money that they have to actually pay for, you know, their cost of living and housing is very low. And they're considered a single household of one, whereas the person receiving that income, you know, has that higher level. It's not considered, I mean, it does go into their income, but it's interesting to me that it's considered income for the individual, but they're only a single household. And so I guess I'm wondering, like, is there a way to then put them at that two-person threshold, or is there any way to account for that to make it a little more level playing ground for folks who have high child support payments they're making?
So Nancy, I don't know about you, but I would say that one way that you could look at this is to count the children in the household, right? So if there are, if there is a situation with, you know, shared parenting, one thing that we've noted is that one parent or the other parent might come in for assistance. And people have asked us the question about, how do you count the household? You know, do you divide the children? How do we do this? But usually the children are included then in the income. And that can, I think, help address it and make it a little bit more fair, because both parents, if, you know, the child support has been distributed in accordance to or proportionate to income, then there's also the assumption that they're going to be parenting these children within that system. So I think that's the challenge. And you're talking about two different households, so they're in one household for part of the time in the other household, but they're certainly in both households.
Yeah, I think our situation would be more when they're not in the household and the person's just paying the support. So, because if they had the kid in the household, then we may, well, if it's not the primary, we could still serve them as single, I guess. But yeah.
Yeah, that is a challenge. I know we've talked about this at our state homeless programs meeting as well with other state organizations. So that's something we can bring back and talk with those folks a little bit more, just to see if we have maybe a way to come to some consensus between programs about how we can manage that.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Christy.
And Suzanne, you have been unmuted.
All right, so this is Susie from Sky Carver, Dakota, CAP agency. And my question is, Jen and I were texting during the meeting, asking each other a couple questions. When you were talking about paperwork, you were asking for all adults in the household to sign the paperwork. And we have only been doing head of household. Just wondering if that was a change or something that you want us to do going forward, if it's best practice to just get them all, or just it, a lot of times somebody's working or something like that, and it would delay an application process.
Right, and so it is best practice to be able to secure like release of information for all members of the household, or signing HMIS for all members of the household. Where it gets tricky is if they aren't signing, for example, the HMIS, then you would not want to share that household's name. You'd want to enter that household adult as anonymous. You could enter the other household member, but you probably would want to enter the one household member as anonymous if they haven't signed. If And if it's stopping you from being able to move forward, you could always secure something from that additional adult later, but then you're also going to be limiting the information that you're sharing. So it's, you know, it basically just means you're only allowed to share on that adult's circumstances. And so if you were communicating with a landlord, for example, you would only be able to communicate with that landlord about that one individual, even though we all know it's probably a household, but that's just something you kind of have to stay within those boundaries. And the other reason would be for income documentation, if you're doing any kind of verification of that, obviously you'd only be able to have, you know, the income verification from one household member if you were contacting an employer, for example. So yeah, most of it just comes down to whatever your sort of reasonable test is in order to get out assistance. In some cases, you're seeing the person in one day, the other person's out of town maybe working and not able to be back, and it just is more practical to move forward. So we do understand those circumstances. I think if we see a second adult in the household, we're just going to ask, you know, where the paperwork is. So if you can't secure that, I would just definitely put that in the file. And then the other thing is just noting that depending on your own agency, we're open to those verbal signatures, right? So if someone's not able to sign, they certainly could give permission for that consent. And that's a possibility, is just to be able to write in that they've given consent to sign the form, and then you're covered. But again, it always depends on the agency and your own legal practices to be able to do that as well.
I'll go through a couple questions in the chat. One question is, if the household is over income with their provided pay stubs, but it's known that their hours are going to be reduced, can we still assist? That one's a little bit tricky. If the month for which they're requesting assistance is also the same month in which they're clearly over income and there's not, you know, for example, the overtime example that I provided earlier is not relevant, it would be hard to justify them being qualified for that month of assistance. However, if you know their hours are being reduced, you could provide them with future assistance. For example, the next month's rent, if it's past due, or a utility bill that's past due. And another question is, it was asking if we can indicate number 6 on the slide again, and that is documenting the need for financial assistance. And so that's normally we'll see that in the file, or it might be provided in an intake file, but it really has to do with just verifying that the household does not have the funds to pay for the assistance for which they're requesting. And Christy,
yeah,
back to you.
That's a great question. It really is something that's most often evident in the case notes, where someone says, you know, there was this situation and we kind of carve that out. As long as they've written something about why they can't pay, we kind of allow for that. But the more obvious, the better. So, you know, just even using the same term that we use, like need for assistance, really helps us find it, especially if it's in your intake form or in your case notes.
One thing I want to add to that is Minnesota Housing is not concerned with the reason that they cannot pay. So if a household decided to throw a birthday party for their child, and because of that they now cannot pay the next month's rent, that's okay with us. We don't want to see that that's a reason that the household is denied. Christy, if there's more hands raised, I'll pass it back to you.
Yep, thank you. Misty, you have been unmuted on my end. And I'll move on. How about Sherry?
Hello, I have a few questions. I'm Sherry from Tri-Valley. And having only been here for a little bit over a year, I am realizing that there are some things that we definitely need to fix and that we may have not been following to the T. So I have like 3 questions. So As far as the ROIs are concerned and getting like every single adult that's in the household signed, I know like specifically in my case, I have also only done head of household. And so I was just wondering if we document in files moving forward from today, instead of going back and trying to, you know, some of our people that we've already closed on that, but we did provide services for, especially for like prevention. Is there some way that, you know, how can we fix this? That we have given services to people that we did not get, you know, proper ROIs for every single household in the house. How can we, how can I fix that, and how can we, you know, we can put it in to move forward that we definitely need to do that before we're giving services to the client. A second question I have is, you talked about making sure that if people are still needing assistance to keep their file open. My question is, if they're at the end of the time that we allow them to be on the program, do we have to ask permission to keep them on? So for like our prevention, the 90 days for them, if we've given them 2 months, you know, and then we're on our 3rd month to keep them open, but then we see they're going to need a 4th and a 5th month. You know, I just need guidance on how we should do that. And then my third question is the resolution part of making sure that it has solved their crisis. I was wondering if when we are entering into HMIS, we have to put down once the services and when we exit them, what their situation is. Would that be sufficient enough information, especially if they went to a Section 8 housing voucher or something like that? Because I found in my case that after we've given services and then, you know, we try to keep them open for a couple of months just in case they need something else. But then when we reach back out to them, we can't find them anymore, or if we leave messages, they don't return the call. So some cases are going to be hard for us to try to actually see if it was resolved. That's all. I know I just overloaded everybody, but
No, those are great questions. So for the release of information, just to let you know, we're going to be monitoring files for the 1st quarter of the year. So it'll go from October 1st, 2021 through December 31st, 2021. And if we, you know, obviously having that information ahead of time, the one thing that we do is a sort of a pre-meeting with the grant administrator to let them know that, you know, what we're going to be monitoring, and that gives staff a chance to talk about the things that they've done. So that would be a great time to say to us, you know, we noticed this error when we went through file monitoring training, and from that day forward, you know, we're moving into using release of information for every adult. But when you review these files from October to December, you may not find those. And then if you do have any open cases that are still receiving assistance from that time frame, you would definitely want to try to secure those at least, so that you can show that you've done that for this time frame, that they're still getting assistance. For the question about keeping the file open for another 30 days, in that circumstance, some local communities have a different range of time that they provide assistance. So there are some communities that might limit assistance for, you know, 4 to 6 months or 3 months. And it's not our program that has that restriction, but it might be another program, like a local program, and how you run yours. And so in that circumstance, you would probably want to talk to your local grant administrator and or advisory committee to see if it's possible for you to extend assistance if needed. We just encourage it because we see that when there is a sharp sort of end to the assistance and then people close the file, sometimes those households come back in and we see, you know, that they've returned again for assistance shortly thereafter, and that information is often in the file as well. So what we're looking for is just really to make sure that that household has stabilized before people are exiting. But we also understand this assistance is limited. Sometimes the reason that assistance is only provided for 3 months is because that's all there is. And in that circumstance, you know, just being able to note that, and if they do, you know, if you do end up having the household open for another month, but you're not going to provide any additional assistance, just making a note, you know, we did see that this household needed additional assistance, and unfortunately we have no more FHPAP funds and we're unable to, you know, secure, or we've exhausted all the rest of the assistance that could be provided. And that's enough of a case note for us to understand what's happening. And then the third question, Nancy, I'm trying to remember, was
the third question had to do with crisis resolution, I believe, and you were asking whether HMIS would be sufficient. So there's kind of a two-part answer. We do recognize that at times when you follow up with the household, because you want to see if they're stably housed and you just can't get a hold of them, you can document that in your case note, indicated, you know, attempted contact 2 times, and closing the file, and then indicate if it was an exit to a program-based Section 8 program, for example, you can include that. HMIS in some cases would be satisfactory. If that's your only method of documenting that, it would require that you have that entire HMIS like entry exit paperwork in the file, and not everyone wants to do that. So that's kind of a two-pronged answer on that one. I hope it answered your question.
Okay, thank you very much.
I think the most common thing that we see, and here's the reason why we asked that question about was the crisis resolved. There have been some circumstances where when the program ends and people are tying out all of their budgets and their expenditures, they realize that a check hasn't been cashed by a landlord. And the family never moved in. They sent it out, and for whatever reason, the household didn't follow through with securing the housing. It's something really, really simple that we've found can help make sure, you know, that the household actually completed the service. And so we're looking for just that really brief case note that says, you know, we issued the check and I called them on Monday. They were all moved in this weekend, you know, like something really simple. So the resolution of the crisis is sort of the immediate thing that happens, right, as a result of your assistance. And whether they continue to stay stably housed, that is something we're certainly interested in. And we appreciate when agencies can follow up, when agencies can keep cases open for the next 30 days, just in case something happens. But we also recognize that that might be like the only thing that we see in the file that says that that crisis was resolved, but it is enough. You know, if you've talked to the household and they've moved all their belongings in, or they, you know, they've received the rent check and it's cashed, that's really a way to be able to tell that that crisis has been resolved. You can even do something as simple as I reached out, you know, and I couldn't get a hold of the household, but I called the landlord and he said, yes, he got the check and everything's good. So something really simple.
I'll take a couple in the chat, and then Christy, I'll pass it back to you. We have about 25 minutes left, so I'm hoping that we can get to all these questions. If we cannot, we'll make sure that we follow up with you to answer them all. I really appreciate all these wonderful questions that we're getting. I think this question, Diane, is related to the scenario that you provided. It was the question around a parent who's paying alimony and that being taken out of their income, and you provided like kind of a possible option to where they could possibly could have their income, their children being in the home kind of considered in that income. So in this case, they're asking, do we need social security numbers for children in the household in that scenario? And Rose, if I totally flubbed up on my interpretation, please feel free to raise your hand so we can unmute you. So in that question, we, like with FHPAP files, we don't need to see the social security number for children. It may be required in other entry paperwork that you have, or perhaps in HMIS, but we don't require that. We would just, you know, if a parent only has partial custody of their children, that's okay. Those children can just be listed as household members, and then perhaps you just add that in a case note.
Yeah, and I mean, I know that, you know, social security numbers are helpful to enter into HMIS because we can receive, you know, the kudos from HMIS when we do our quarterly data monitoring and so on, and the quality monitoring that happens. That's always really good because it keeps those numbers really high for your organization. But there are circumstances where social security numbers are not available, or maybe they don't have a copy of them, or maybe the situation is one where someone's undocumented. So just, you know, note that we do have a little bit of leeway there. It just means that your HMIS reports might note that there's, you know, some households that don't have social security, so it might note that as an error. But we certainly don't. We don't have any kind of finding about that for our monitoring, right, Nancy? There's not something that we would be writing in a letter during our monitoring, at the very least.
That's correct. One more question. For calculating household income, do you need to include the roommate's income, even if the roommate does not need FHPAP assistance? We had a question about this just today, ironically. There's kind of two scenarios here. Sometimes the roommates have separate leases, and then that's a really easy one. You would just have that lease document to refer to the portion of that roommate's rent and the assistance that you're providing. If the roommates are on a shared lease, you can just provide assistance to that one roommate. It's a little bit trickier because you would need to get a copy of the lease or some kind of verification from the landlord, the breakdown between the portion that each roommate is paying. If you're requesting a copy of that lease, you would then need to get the roommate's authorization to receive that. So it's a little bit tricky, but definitely the short answer is yes, you can help one roommate and not the other. And if you run into a scenario that's a little bit fuzzy, feel free to reach out to us or your FHPAP coordinator or supervisor, but we welcome anybody reaching out to us with those questions as well. Christy, if there's more questions, more hands raised, I'll pass it to you for a couple.
Great, I have 3. Mike?
Hey all, just had a quick follow-up on the number 6 about the documenting the housing crisis that can be resolved. Makes a lot of sense for prevention households where obviously a crisis comes up and they need money to pay the rent so they don't lose their housing. Can you give us some examples, maybe just, I think, in terms of somebody who's experiencing homelessness and how that might differ? Because that feels like it's a little bit different story to tell in the case files. I just want to make sure that, one, we're communicating effectively to our providers about what that looks like, or if there's examples maybe that I'm not thinking of that'd be easy to document there.
Yeah, that's actually a really good clarification, Mike. If the household is homeless, then that is considered a housing crisis. So that would be documented kind of on the front end as you're identifying the type of assistance you're providing households, whether it's rapid rehousing, for example, that would be for only homeless households. We would then make that assumption that the household is experiencing homelessness, which would be enough documentation for the crisis. So good point that it's much more applicable in a situation where the household is receiving prevention funds than when they're actually experiencing homelessness.
Perfect, thank you. That makes it a lot easier.
And Rose.
So my question, well, I was trying to calculate their income, and they have a deduction, so they only receive a certain amount after, because I guess they were getting like overpayments. So do I calculate the amount that they get monthly, like on their card, or do I go by the amount that they were initially like supposed to get before that amount comes off, because it just automatically comes out?
Yeah, that's a good question. There's probably some circumstances where there have been overpayments either for unemployment or for even MFIP, for example, there might be, or even Social Security, and then there gets to be an adjustment. In most cases, there's usually a letter from the county that shows the adjusted monthly amount that you could secure, and that could be enough documentation to say this is their current, kind of amount. If it's related to a deduction as a result of employment itself, like it's something on the paycheck that's being deducted, we might need to see that circumstance individually. So it might be easier just to contact us and send us examples of the paperwork that you're looking at. Some of these are tricky, so I would say if it's county related funding, like a mainstream benefit of some kind, you could potentially get a letter from the county saying this is the monthly income that they're receiving. But if it's something through like a deduction on a paycheck, that might be a little trickier, and then you want to get a hold of us.
And then, so somebody doesn't have income, and they did the MPAT and they scored pretty high on it. Would we then, because they qualify for like either like 12 to 24 months of assistance, so then would we just help them with assistance, like if they needed to pay their rent when they needed help, or would we help with assistance to pay their rent until they get an income?
Yeah, so if a household has no income, you're obviously going to, document that in your case notes at the very least, or have a form. A lot of people have that zero income form. They just have the household sign. And then you could pay the household's rent until they were able to pay the rent on their own. The limit for our assistance is 24 months, and that's a statewide rule. But each local program has their own set of rules that might be more restricted than that, related to how many months of assistance they can receive. So I would look to your local grant administrator to see if there's any limits on that. But otherwise, you could pay the rent for the household until they become employed, and it just depends on how you decide to run the program. In some circumstances, programs will pay the rent for a household ongoing under rapid rehousing, for example. And then when the household gains some income, they have the household pay a portion. It's often 30% of the income, because that's sort of the ideal that people see households paying for housing. And so a lot of times we see programs structured where they'll then pay a portion of the rent and the household pays a portion going forward. So you could still potentially continue to pay some assistance to a household that becomes employed if they're not yet making enough to pay the rent.
Okay. I think that's all of the questions I have.
Okay, and for sure, if you have another one, feel free to jump in.
Oh, that website where the recording will be posted.
Yes, we'll send out a link to that. So, and our website in general is MN, like Minnesota, mnhousing.gov. And then if you look on the main page, you can click on the right-hand side, sort of toward the bottom, there's something called grant programs. And when you click that, you'll see the Family Homeless Prevention and Assistance Program link. but we'll make sure to send that out too.
Okay.
Thanks for your questions.
And Nancy, I have four more hands raised.
Okay.
And I'll move on. Donna.
Hi, can you hear me?
We can.
Good afternoon, thank you. So I have a question concerning case noting. So if I have a scenario, if I'm working with the youth and we are together, let's say 2 hours, 2 to 3 hours doing apartment setup, which is shopping at Walmart for their apartment. And are you looking for notes with explaining the entire time while we're there? There was a situation where someone said, oh, your notes doesn't reflect the hours spent with the youth. And also, what is considered strength-based noting without it being that you're just like objective?
Nancy, do you want to take that one?
Sure. I would first defer to your agency's policy about what is required for noting. There's different types of notes that some agencies subscribe to. We are not looking for FHPAP. We're not requiring a detail by minute by minute summary of what you did with that household. So in the example that you provided, you could indicate took client shopping to Walmart for household supplies. And that is enough. Now, some case notes allow for you to enter the time that you actually spent with that household, and that can often be helpful because then it shows like you were with that household for 2 hours. And if your case note format doesn't allow for that, then perhaps that's something that check with your agency and supervisor, but perhaps that's something that you could add. To be 1 o'clock to 2:45 p.m. Took client to Walmart to shop for household supplies.
Yes, and actually it's in our policy to be really brief and concrete with how we work with our youth. There's also a section in the apricot where it says the duration of the time spent with youth, and that I can note in there as well. And I know most people don't even use that. It's not really required, but it's there. It's a drop down that's there, and I often use it each time I'm noting.
Yeah, that can be convenient, and it's a hard situation in looking at case notes sometimes for us too, because we might only be looking at one file, and that could be a file where maybe there were attempts at contact or things happening with the client that didn't get noted. That might have been something that would be helpful to know, but we just didn't see it. So just keep in mind that when Nancy and I go out to monitor files, we are typically only monitoring a few files for each agency. And so if one happens to be for a case manager out of the 50 people they worked with, and that one just doesn't have a lot of detail and unfortunately was the one, don't let that reflect everything about the work that you're doing. I would also say the kind of the strength-based piece would just be keeping to the statements about, like client stated, or trying to have like more neutral language and not anything that appears to be an opinion or a judgment. And so a strength-based model might also identify something that the client did that was proactive. So for example, oh, the client reached out to me and was interested in, shopping for household items, or the client, advocated for themselves in this circumstance, or something that's more strength-based just as a note can really be helpful in files. And especially if the client themselves one day asked to see that file, then that's always a nice thing to read about, is where they were doing well.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks. Great questions. There's a question saying, is there a percentage of applications that can depart from the MPAT score? Again, I have a two-pronged response. That's my thing today, apparently. Number one, I would really defer to the needs and desires of the grantee. Oftentimes in applications, we do ask applicants to describe what is their target population. And it's very common to see that the primary, for example, our priority population will be households that score between 10 and 16 on the MPAT. So if you go outside of that range, make sure that if you're receiving your supervisor, or if you have the ability to make that determination, we're fine with that as well. So just making sure that you're subscribing to the expectations of your grantee. And then also we recognize that there will be some scores outside of that range. And as long as you're documenting that the reason why you're choosing to serve that household, that's okay. Now, if we were to see that 80% of the households are averaging a score of 5, and the proposal is to serve households that need longer term assistance, that's where we would be concerned. But generally, we don't run into that situation.
And Nancy, I want to clarify, we would be concerned or elated, because that probably means that you've done such a great job that you no longer have households that are facing.
That's even better.
Yeah, but we're, so either way, we'll have a good conversation about what happens.
And again, I really want to stress that we defer largely to you as the staff that are working directly with these households. We know the MPAT tool is not a perfect tool, and you know that household. And so if you determine that they really need the assistance from your agency to get stabilized, we're okay with that. We trust you. So just document that in the file. All right. We have a couple comments in here, Dan, and I had not heard this, indicating that they've been told from ICA not to use anonymous anymore in HMIS. That's new to me. We may have to circle back. I know, Jen, you're one of them, and circle back with ICA.
Yeah, I hadn't heard that either. Is there an alternative to what could be utilized if you don't have a name that you can share? And I don't know if someone can unmute to talk about that, but
let's see if I can find Jen.
I think it improves your data quality, right? Not to have missing data elements. So that part makes sense to me, but that's for all variables.
And I know HUD is not always pleased if there's data missing, and there are times when a household just does not want to be included in HMIS. Jen Romero was one person that asked the question. She's no longer with us. But we'll check into that, and we'll circle back with with coordinators, and we'll learn more about that. It's a really big question, and that's new to us. There's a question like, is there anything that's required in regards to case management besides case notes? If you refer to our FHPAP program guide, we identify some of the core elements of case management that were identified from many years ago. I think around the time they came out with the first plan to prevention and homelessness in Minnesota, where they described several elements to case management. And so that's a really good place to start. There's also some really good case management trainings that are available, like through MESH and I think other areas that can provide you kind of more of an in-depth answer. But some of those elements include, and it depends on the type of assistance and intensity of services you're providing, but at a minimum, assessment and provision of resources, goal planning, and follow-up. So those are 4 examples of that. So, and again, if you're providing one-time assistance for prevention, the case management you provide for that household will look different than a household that you're providing 6 to 9 months of assistance in, because they're a rapid rehousing household. Sarah, are there any more hands raised?
Yes, I'm going to go back and try Ahmed again.
Please.
Oh, I didn't realize you said Ahmed. I didn't hear it too clear. I apologize.
Hi, Ahmed.
Hi, everybody. Sorry. I also typed, excuse me, I don't know what's happening to my voice today. I also typed my question in the chat box. Yeah. So it's about, the question is there flexibility around the every 3 months recertification requirement, that you talked about earlier, and that's in our prevention provider and requirements for our prevention providers as to do intake to determine re-eligibility after a household or resident has stayed in the system and the program for 3 months. Second question is, so that I've been hearing this from a couple of people since we've been socializing this new referral system that we want to launch very soon, resulting from the prevention coordination design work. Whether or not the impact tool can be replaced, that it will help them, it will help providers to speed things up, because the way the referral new system is, we're asking them to turn around quickly, and some say, well, this impact tool thing is a burden. I just want, if there's been any conversation or mention of that somewhere. Someone mentioned that even Minnesota Housing, it's mentioned something about this before.
That's a great question. I mean, the MPAT tool came out of quite a few years of work, both at the national level and then also locally, as we were trying to manage the limited number of resources available. And so that MPAT tool was designed based on some larger cities that had utilized it across the nation, and then trying to modify it to meet what we felt were prevention risk areas in Minnesota. And we do have the ability to allow for an alternative tool instead of the MPAT. And you can contact us about that, and we can create a situation where there might be a waiver. I realize that in Hennepin's circumstance, you've done a lot of work on the prevention design and have kind of a coordinated front entry or single door, I would say, for prevention that you've created. So it does make sense that it would need to work for all of the prevention programs, and that FHPAP is a small portion of Hennepin's prevention sort of system. So we're really a tiny piece of that in Hennepin County compared to some other areas in the state. So yeah, reach out to us directly about that. And then for the question on the 3 months, as Nancy indicated, we don't have a very clear, line in the sand on the 3 months. It's best practice that we've identified through some of the other models that we've seen, like the critical time intervention, how often kind of how often makes sense in order to reassess income for people to be able to move out of programs. That said, that if your program is doing something at 4 months or 6 months because of the way that you've designed your program, it isn't going to be out of compliance with FHPAP currently, because we don't have that policy that says you absolutely have to do a reassessment every 3 months. There are other programs that do require reassessment at certain time intervals, even some that are operated by our agency. So I don't want to be confusing, but we just have it as best practice for now, and we've left that flexible sort of intentionally to make sure that programs can set up a design for their community that makes the most sense for them.
We have time for just a couple more questions. And there are several in the chat. I don't think we've maybe hit about half of them. So I'm really pleased with that. And I'm also very sorry that we're running out of time. Diane and I will talk after this meeting, and we'll see if we can come up with a way where we can entertain more questions from you. Maybe it's just hosting another meeting just for case managers to take questions from you. But either way, we'll do our very best to respond to all the questions that we've received. This question is, if a household income increases to the point that they're ineligible, but they really need supports, is there a guideline for how long we can provide just the support services and not direct support? This is a tough one. We've talked about this. We've kind of gone back and forth, and it is determined that if a household is over income, they are not eligible for direct assistance or support services through FHPAP. Sometimes households are receiving other funding assistance, for example, from OEO, like the Homeless Youth Act or THP, and those income requirements are different. So if at all possible, if there's another funding source that can provide that follow-up assistance, we're really recognizing that households may need that and appreciate that you want to provide that. And unfortunately with FHPAP, they would not be eligible. The last question that we'll take is, we're only doing coordinated entry and outreach. We do not provide funds. Do we still need to show income documentation and score documents? That's a really great question, and the answer to that is no. The funds that we pay for coordinated entry staff are just for the activity of doing household assessments, and we realize not all households will meet FHPAP eligibility, and that's okay. And the same holds true for street outreach, especially when that assistance is very short-term, limited contact. So we are at the end of our time. I'm just so pleased with the number of people that joined us. Thank you so much. I hope that this was helpful. And I want to extend the invitation for any of you to reach out to us anytime that you have a question about eligibility, income verification, what have you. Of course, you may have internal processes and management or someone higher up may say, come to us first. But I just want to let you know the invite's open from Diane and I for you to reach out anytime.
Nancy, just for practical things, we are definitely sending out the PowerPoint and sending out those links. We'll send out the file checklist and we'll make sure that everyone knows how to get on our website so you can see the income documentation form that you can use. For the questions that were asked in today's chat, I think we can collect those and then add answers to them and be able to distribute that as a document as well. So we could do that along with some of the other things. And maybe we'll send in a couple of batches so that you at least get the PowerPoint and other information first, and then we'll work on the questions and get those out to you as well. So if you do have questions that you didn't have a chance to ask in the chat, just as Nancy said, email us, let us know, and we can add that to those questions.
Thanks so much, everyone. Have a good weekend.
Wonderful workshop. Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good weekend.
Everyone.